So here we are in welcome and overview, and then WDFW staff will be providing an HPA background, legislation, process, and timeline for about 10 minutes. Staff will be reviewing the current rule and potential changes for 15 minutes. And then there'll be a 25-minute opportunity for a question answer period. And then we'll move into next steps for 5 minutes. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Margan to introduce Margan Carlson with WDFW to introduce yourself and your staff. So go ahead and take it away, Margan.
Thanks so much, Joy. Good morning, everybody. My name is Margan Carlson. I'm the Habitat Program Director here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Thank you very much for being here and spending your time with us. As Joy said, I'll start by asking Teresa Nation and Matt Curtis to introduce themselves. Teresa, why don't you go ahead? You're on mute.
I'm a professional. Thanks for joining us all. My name is Teresa Nation. I am an environmental planner in the Habitat program, and I am coordinating and heading up this rulemaking project.
Thank you so much for being here, Teresa. Matt, go ahead.
Morning all, my name is Matt Curtis. I am the Protection Division Manager here in the Habitat Program at Department of Fish and Wildlife. I supervise Teresa and other Protection Division staff and work directly for Margan here at DFW.
Thank you so much, Matt. So as I said earlier, we're all very grateful for your time, whether you're joining us live here or tuning in an hour later to TVW. You are all busy and smart people, and we appreciate you lending your time and attention to us. As Joy said, this rulemaking effort is about substitute Senate Bill 5273, sponsored by Senator Solomon. This rulemaking is in particular near and dear to our hearts because the bill provided some explicit direction from the legislature intended to help us manage Puget Sound shorelines and make sure that we have the abilities to look at the health of Puget Sound shorelines and what that means for fish as we're looking at projects folks have submitted that wish to replace existing shoreline armoring. The team here is going to get into a little bit more detail, but again, as I hope you'll see, the intent of this bill is to improve environmental protections for shorelines and for the fish that use them. And the legislature adopted some fairly specific direction to us, which provides some really great sideboards in this rulemaking. Again, I'm going to stay on hand. Matt and Teresa are going to take the presentation away, but really looking forward to the discussion and the question and answer. Thank you. Thanks, Joy.
Thank you, Margan. Annalise, if you don't mind advancing the slides, and we'll hand it off to Teresa Nation with WDFW to walk us through some of these slides. Also, Annalise, if you could add in the information for public comment in the chat, that would be helpful. All right, Teresa, go ahead and take it away, please.
And I'm actually going to start things
off.
Oh,
it's Matt starting us out.
That's right. Teresa's
Matt.
She's going to pick up where I left off. So
Perfect.
When we do these webinars for the public, I think it's really helpful for us to start with a little background information and also to give an opportunity to try to cover the alphabet soup of acronyms that happens to all of us here in state government. So bear with me, everyone. I'm going to lead us through a little bit of background. If you're already caught up on all this, I apologize. These first couple minutes will be review for you, but if you're sort of new to this process, I hope this little bit will be helpful. So Annalise, if you want to forward one slide. Okay. So a little bit about background about WDFW's regulatory authority and how this applies to the rulemaking effort. The state legislature gave the Department of Fish and Wildlife the responsibility of preserving and protecting and perpetuating all fish and shellfish resources for the state. To assist in achieving that goal, way back in the glory days, the state legislature in 1943 passed a state law now known as the Hydraulic Code. This is the statutory authority for WDFW to regulate construction projects in state waters. And it resides in chapter 77.55 of what's called the Revised Code of Washington, aka the RCW is how we refer to it. It states, and you can see some of the excerpts from that RCW here on your screen, that any person, organization, or government agency wishing to conduct a hydraulic project must do so under the terms of a permit issued by WDFW, and defines a hydraulic project as work that will use, divert, obstruct, or change the natural flow of the bed or any of the salt or fresh waters of the state. And you can go to the next slide, Annalise. Implementation, the permit that I referred to in the previous slide in the RCW is commonly known as what's called the Hydraulic Project Approval, or HPA. And the rules implementing that law are found in chapter 220.660 of the Washington Administrative Code, commonly called the WAC. These rules guide our implementation of the statute, including the way we review and condition our hydraulic project approvals, HPAs, and any other procedures for issuing, appealing, and enforcing these permits. We already have rules that govern marine shoreline stabilization projects, and they are found in WAC 220.660.370. And I bring that up because that is relevant to the rulemaking that we're doing here. Next slide, Annalise. So the rulemaking effort, why are we doing it? This entire process is meant to make sure that the rules in WAC that implement how we interpret, and work with our authority align with the laws that are in our RCW. And WDFW is currently undergoing the rulemaking for chapter 220.660 to incorporate what was directed to us from Senate Bill 5273. And specifically, these changes apply to the marine shoreline stabilization projects. And that's, again, described in chapter 220.660.370. Next slide, Annalise. Okay, the fun one. And I'm sorry, this is a fairly busy slide, but rulemaking is a fairly busy process. And so this is sort of the calendar events for how we are moving through this specific rulemaking proposal, but it's also a general outline for how we move through all of our rulemaking efforts. Everything begins with a CR 101 pre-proposal. That's basically our announcement to the world that, hey, heads up, we're doing rulemaking on this particular set of code. And what you do is you publish that announcement with the state register. And we did that back in May. And there's a preliminary announcement that goes out to the tribes and then also the public at that time. The next step is to do early outreach. And we do this early outreach to try to get as much feedback, suggestions, any kind of responses from anyone who might be concerned or interested in the rule when we put out that CR 101 announcement. We coordinated and gave a presentation to the tribal leaders in August. We also had an invitational review that was also done sort of in the middle of that month. And then we gave a presentation to our citizen advisory group, the Hydraulic Code Implementation Citizen Advisory Group, commonly called the CAG, at the beginning of September. Once we had all that feedback, responses, everything from as diverse a group as we could possibly get to help us figure out, what this rule actually needed to look like, we put together a draft rule proposal and published that in what's called the CR 102. And that was just put out last week in the state register. And that's why we are giving a public webinar here today. This is our sort of follow-up to that 102 announcement for public consumption. There's also sort of behind the scenes, there's the SEPA and public comment periods that will run through the end of the month that the public and other folks can provide feedback to. And we're also, the WDFW's commission is also hosting a public hearing on this later this month on October 28th for some more back and forth question and answering with that group as well. Once we get all the feedback that we possibly can from the 102 process, we will put together sort of a final draft rule, if you will, to brief the Fish and Wildlife Commission in mid-November. And they will have the opportunity to vote yay or nay on that final rule language. Assuming that we get a yay from them, we will put together what's called the CR 103 final rule, which we will file with the Office of the Code Reviser in December, assuming no big hiccups or issues. And then once we do that, 30 days later, that rule becomes effective in WAC. So I know that was a lot to digest. The important bit for all of you right now is that we are in the middle of this process with the CR 102, and you have an opportunity to ask us questions and review sort of our work thus far here today and throughout the month. And I'm going to turn this over now to Teresa Nation to do two things. One, to cover anything I left out or got wrong. And to number two, go into some more of the technical details about our rulemaking effort. And thank you, guys.
Thanks, Matt. I just wanted to make a really quick note before we move to the next slide. For those of you who are not familiar with SEPA, yet another acronym, that stands for State Environmental Policy Act. And SEPA is basically a process to identify potential environmental impacts that may result from projects or government decisions. So for example, a new housing development or a bridge replacement, those sorts of on-the-ground projects, for example. And then also what we call non-project actions, which is what this is, what this rule proposal is. It's a non-project action because it involves an administrative decision, not an actual on-the-ground built thing. And so the SEPA review process is just helps the department and also the public to understand how a proposal may affect the environment. And so that actually has its own unique comment period, but we're running it at the same time as the comment period for the rule proposal itself. And you can find information on how to make SEPA comments on that link that is in the chat now, if you go to that website. Okay, so next slide. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Substitute Senate Bill 5273. So that actually passed in 2021 and went into effect over a year ago. It went into effect in July of 2021. So the department has actually already been implementing the requirements in that rule. But we're also working to make sure that we integrate those requirements into our rules. And I think I said law or rule. I meant that we're implementing that law. But we will have it also in our rule once we're done with this rulemaking process. So so that new statutory language is found in the section that Matt already mentioned in the Revised Code of Washington 7755 and specifically in 231. So if you really want to go look that up, you can jot down that reference. But I'm going to tell you a lot more about all this, so you might not have to. It's interesting to note that the language from 5273 is actually really similar to some language that we already have in our rules. And that language is in section 370, which Matt also mentioned. And that section is the part of the rules that covers marine shoreline stabilization projects. And when I talk about stabilization, just so we're all on the same page, I'm talking about the full spectrum, anything from passive techniques like planting vegetation to help stabilize a bank to soft shore techniques to your traditional hard armoring approaches like bulkheads and revetments. And so section 370 has language, the language in section 370 that was modeled in the new law is actually requirements that apply to new shoreline stabilization projects and also to waterward replacement of shoreline stabilization projects. And so what we've got coming to us from 5273 is that those same standards are now applied for a third category of projects, and that is the replacement of residential shoreline stabilization. Next, yep, thank you. And And so the kind of the easiest way to go through what we're doing with this rule proposal is to use this table. And what we've got in the left column is some notes on elements that are already in our rules, that already exist in the rules. And then we've also got notes in the second column about what is coming to us from the new law that through 5273. And then the third column is how we're putting those two together. So what we're proposing, how we're changing the existing rule so that it incorporates all the new stuff from the law. And so, as I mentioned in the previous slide, what's in rule right now is some standards that we have already established for new shoreline stabilization and waterward replacement projects. And what has come to us from the legislature is very similar standards for replacement of residential shoreline stabilization. And so in a very general sense, basically what we're doing with this rule proposal is we're adding that third project category of the residential replacement projects in with our already existing standards for new shoreline stabilization and waterward replacement of shoreline stabilization. So that's sort of the really big picture of what we're doing, but we'll dig into a little bit more into the details now. One of the things that we say in the rule already is that a project must use the least impacting technically feasible alternative. And so make a note of that phrase, least impacting technically feasible alternative, because you're going to hear it again several times. We'll talk some more about it, but that is also a requirement that is now applied via the new law to replacement of residential stabilization. And so in basically, we're just adding that in. I think I kind of already explained that in the previous line, but this is a specific requirement that was mirrored directly from rule to law, and now we're incorporating it in a more complete way into the rule. And so the next thing you'll want to look at is that what we already have in rule is an alternatives list. It's in order from most to least preferred. And these are alternatives that are in preference depending on their impact to fish life. So our most preferred alternative is the one that's going to have the least impact to fish life or fish habitats. And so that is a list already in rule for new shoreline stabilization and waterward replacement of shoreline stabilization. Now in the new law, we have a separate, very, very similar, but slightly nuanced differently list of least preferred alternatives. And so we worked really hard on trying to think of different ways to marry those two lists so that we could have just one single list in the rule. But we didn't want to lose a few of those nuances. And so what we ended up doing was going ahead and bringing in that new list from the law into the rule, and also still retaining that previous list. So depending on what project type, you'll look at the list that is relative to the project type that you're thinking of when you're reading the rule. Okay. Oh, and also if I'm not going to go into the details right now on what that preferred alternatives list looks like, but if folks are interested in hearing more about it, go ahead and ask during the question and answer period, and I can talk some more on that topic. Okay, and next slide. Thank you. So we have in rule already a requirement that someone who is proposing one of these shoreline stabilization projects has to provide a site assessment and alternatives analysis report, and that report has to be prepared by a qualified professional. And so what came to us through the law for the residential replacement projects is also a site assessment and alternatives analysis report. And so this is another case that's pretty simple, that we just are able to plug in that third project category into our existing rule. The one piece that didn't come directly from statute is the qualified professional part. However, we want to treat those residential projects the same as the other projects. And so we are requiring that those reports for residential replacement projects be prepared by a qualified professional. And one of the things that does is it helps with consistency. It helps us to make sure that the reports that we receive when someone puts in their application for their permit are complete and they're accurate. These are pretty technical reports. They require specialized knowledge and training. And we want them to come in already accurate in order to avoid holdups in permit processing. And then also having that third party, for most folks, it'll be a third party produce that report, adds an element of impartiality too. Okay, so what does the report look like? Well, we have in rule already identified some mandatory report requirements. The new statute did not have that level of detail in it, and so we are simply plugging in keeping consistent for all three project types with the same, so that they all have the same mandatory report components. And again, this is another one that I'm not going to go into the detail right now on what those components are, other than to say they're not changing. But if someone wants me to go over those during the Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about that then. And then let's see, we have, so the agency has the ability to provide exemptions to the report, and that's already spelled out in the rule. It's also spelled out exactly the same way in the new statute. And so we are retaining that discretion for all those three project types to be able to do a case-by-case report exemption if appropriate. We have, however, gone ahead and added a little bit of new language specifying the exemptions specifying across the board exemptions for beach restoration and passive shoreline techniques from that reporting requirement. And that is more for clarification than anything, because those particular projects already are the most preferred alternative. So they've already met that most preferred alternative standard. Okay, and next slide. Okay, so I'm going to take a sip of water. So let's talk about the phrase least impacting technically feasible alternative. So it's a little bit of a mouthful, but again, we've already provided, the rule and the statute have that preferred alternatives list. But the term feasible is not defined in rule at this time. However, the legislature decided that they wanted to go ahead and provide a specific definition for it. And so that's in that middle column there. So they've defined feasible as available and capable of being done after taking into consideration cost, existing technology, and logistics in light of overall project purposes. And so we scratched our heads a little bit about what to do with this definition, or how to implement this definition into our rule, because in law it really only specifically applies to replacement residential shoreline stabilization projects. However, after looking at our process of evaluating permits and evaluating projects, we really realized that what the legislature said actually is pretty spot on for our own review process. So it's basically the sorts of considerations we're already giving while reviewing a project for permitting. And so we've gone ahead and just applied that definition for all three project types, so the entire section 370. And we don't expect this to actually have any sort of on the ground change, because we're there already as far as we can tell. Yeah. And then we did, there's a piece that is a little bit new. It's an administrative piece, which we wanted to spell out for folks, both permits applicants, as well as our own permitting biologists, so that everyone's on the same page. But this is for emergency permit applications and expedited permit applications. So these are for situations that have a critical time component associated with them. These projects are still held to the same least impacting technically feasible alternative standard, and they do still have that requirement of submitting a report. However, when when a winter storm comes in and causes damage and something needs to be fixed right away, there's not necessarily time to go through that entire process before doing any work. So we've just spelled out exactly how the pathway forward goes for allowing for timely actions to address those critical situations, but also still complying with statute and with existing rule. And so applicants may be allowed to proceed with work to address that particular emergency situation before submitting that report with the site assessment and alternatives analysis. But they will be required to follow up with one within 90 days of issuance of that permit. And so once that report has been generated, it's possible that someone might have to go back and do some more work on their site in order to bring their project up to the standard of least impacting technically feasible alternative. And for those, this may sound kind of new to most or to a lot of you, but if there's anyone out there who's really familiar with the entirety of the hydraulic code, you'll recognize this language because it's a very similar approach to what we've taken for other project types in relationship to emergency and expedited situations. And so those are the main highlights of the rule proposal. We've got, we did a little bit of reorganizing just for readability and incorporated the term shoreline stabilization in lieu of a variety of terms that were found in statute and rule, so that we have some consistency throughout the rule now. And that's it for the actual rule. Go ahead and flip to the next slide, Annalise. And so as you've heard several times already, we are in our comment period, and we would love to hear from you if you have thoughts about this rule. We've got a whole bunch of different ways to submit comments. But most of the comments we expect will come in online through our public input comment portal. So that's that very first address there at the top of the page. But you can find all of this information on that project website, which is highlighted in yellow down at the bottom, and has also been added to the chat. So that's the website where you can find all this stuff. So don't worry too much about scribbling down a whole bunch of addresses and emails and whatnot. So yeah, feel free to make comments. We'd love to hear from you. And that's it for my presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Teresa. There are some questions here in the chat, and I just want to guide you all to the bottom of your screen here. You'll see there is a Q&A option, and there's a chat option, and we're requesting that you add your questions into the chat. And so John had a question. Let me just navigate to John's question here. All right. Okay. John's question is, will, quote, least impacting technically feasible alternative, end quote, include relocation of existing structures?
And Teresa, do you want to talk a little bit about how we could or could not marry the two lists a little bit in this case? Because we do have relocation as part of our new shoreline armoring, but it was not included in the list of options in Senate Bill 5273.
Yeah, actually, Annalise, do you want to flip to the next slide? This is one of my backup in case we need it slides. So this is a comparison of the two lists of preferred alternatives. The one on the left is the one that's already in rule, and then the one on the right is the one that came straight from the statute. And I think we've got, let's see, we've got item 4 on that left list is does involve the relocation of existing structures. And let's make, I want to be clear on structures. And I actually did a little bit of wordsmithing in the rule just because, just for consistency's sake. But when we talk about relocating improvements in structures, we're talking about relocating things like houses or septic fields or wells or that sort of thing. And that is something that we definitely wanted to, that's actually one of the specific nuances that we wanted to keep in our rule but it did not show up in the new statutory language. And so that is actually one of the reasons that we kept the two lists, is because we wanted that. But we would definitely encourage for residential replacement projects. I mean, if there's a better way to do a project that it would involve, say, a simple relocation of some kind of a structure improvement, then we would definitely have that conversation at the permitting biologist level about different alternatives for that site to achieve the goal of protecting what needs protecting.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. And John, if you have follow-up questions, just go ahead and add those into the chat. The next question is from Brittany. Brittany has a question around how residential is defined, and she gives an example. Does there need to be an existing residence, or is residential zoning enough? And then there's a second question. Does the residence need to be usable? Morgan?
Yeah, I think I'll take this one. So no, I don't believe we provide a definition for residential, but typically the Department of Fish and Wildlife relies on local governments, on cities and counties as the leads for the state in determining sort of land uses and zoning. And most typically what we find is that zoning identification is the pivotal piece. Brittany, good question.
Thank you, Morgan. And I think you may be best suited to answer this next question as well. How is feasible cost determined? This is from Tina.
Yeah, that's also a good question. So let's see if I can remember back to the important discussions that were happening as this bill was being finalized. You'll remember perhaps that the definition talks about considerations of feasibility, including cost, whether the technology is available and capable of being implemented relative to the purpose of the project, both for the applicant and from WDFW's perspective in terms of protecting fish life. Some of the discussion from the legislature at the time was wanting to make sure that cost was a consideration, but also wanting to make sure that the direction about cost or the incorporation of cost wasn't so black and white, such that a small or a proportionally small increase in cost automatically meant that we would not require the alternative that's the most protective of fish life. And so at the end, the legislature decided not to provide hard sideboards around cost, and instead left the department to continue implementing, as Teresa Nation said, mostly what our current practice is around cost. And so generally, our current practice that we would intend to continue is thinking carefully about what the purpose of the project is for the applicant, thinking carefully about what risk is presented from that project to fish life, what the alternatives are to best protect fish life, and where cost becomes sort of an extenuating factor or a significant proportional increase. And if there is a similar alternative that does a similar job protecting fish life and is a similar cost, then those are all the things that we would consider. So essentially, that approach relies on a lot of the individual regulatory biologist knowledge of the site specifics, as well as the specifics of the project being proposed by the applicant, to weigh those in turn. And that's the approach we're going to continue with. I hope that helps, Tina.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. Tracy has 2 questions, and we'll just open this one up to staff, WDFW staff. Tracy asked, will there be more guidance on the site assessment and alternatives analysis report in the future beyond the basic outline in the WAC 220-660-370?
And I think I can take a little bit of that one to start off with, and Morgan and Teresa can help me round it out. We've already had a couple of examples come through where we've had to put some thought to this about when and where we would require the report versus where we would exempt it. Because I noticed Tracy, your second question there. And I think if I give an example, it might help you see sort of how we've been thinking about this. So we had an example of a shoreline homeowner that wanted to do the right thing, do a good project, and they got a permit for installing a very pretty cool, actually, soft shore stabilization project. The following winter, they were hammered by a storm, and that soft shore project failed, causing some flooding around their house. For something like that, where they tried something softer, a preferred alternative first, and then it didn't work out. When they came in for a harder structure, there was no need for us to require a report in that case, because they had already tried a preferred alternative. It didn't work. The best alternative for them at that point was to try something a little harder to see how that worked. There will be other sort of, similar ways of thinking where it's evident or obvious that there aren't many options, or that the preferred alternatives are, going to be the best solid option for a homeowner. And in those cases, there's not a reason for us to require the report in those cases. But I think what you'll see is that for most projects where there's not a sort of defined pathway, the report will be required from us.
Thanks, Matt. All right. Tracy, I just want to note that your question around the definition of a qualified professional is included in the chat. Teresa added that in. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just say that is a definition from rule. It is defined in rule at this point. So that can be found in WAC 220-660-030. That's that quote's straight from the WAC.
Okay, great. Tracy has another question. I noticed there is an exemption for report requirement based on, quote, scale and nature of project, unquote. Is this defined?
So Matt, maybe you can expand on the example that you were giving previously. That's not defined in either law or rule. And again, that gives room for WDFW biologists and management to consider the site specifics, both the environmental specifics of the particular site, as well as the specifics of the project or the circumstances, facing that project and that site. And Matt, I don't know if you want to build on the example you were giving previously.
And there's not That's right, Marty. And there's not much to add to that, except that we've also seen projects where, rather than, replace wholesale an entire an entire site, they're doing just a small piece of a replacement structure or something like that, where it makes more sense to just allow sort of a minor replacement of a project, rather that's similar to what's existing than redo the whole thing in a different scape. And in one case, that might be a reason for that exemption as well. Other than that, I don't think I have much to add, Marty.
The only thing I would add to that, Matt, thank you, is typically we would use that kind of option or discretion to either, like Teresa was saying, if it's really clear that the alternative being proposed is already sort of the preferred alternative relative to fish life, or it's sort of removing infrastructure from the shoreline and not replacing it. Sometimes that may not exactly line up with the definitions that are provided, and yet WDFW can see that the alternative is clearly about sort of restoration of shoreline processes or removing infrastructure. Conversely, like the example that Matt gave earlier, sometimes there are particular sites that have been problematic over time, or there's history, as Matt described, where we've been a partner and to that particular site and project proponent, and we've already permitted a different version, and collectively we've learned from the successes of failures of that, and it's easy to see then that the project application is the natural outgrowth of those things that we've already tried. And so again, that would be a case where our experience together is actually having walked through the least impacting preferred alternatives.
Thank you, Morgan. Ian has a question, and Morgan has offered to answer Ian's question. I will read it. It seems as if they primarily, let me start over. It seems as if the primary update happening here is associated with clarifying that the rule applies to residential structures. Is this a correct read? Was there a perception that the rule process did not apply to residential structures before?
Very close, Ian, and thanks for the chance to summarize too. That's probably helpful to others as well. The primary update prompted by this bill and in this rule proposal is to make it clear that the requirements around least impacting preferred alternative and doing an alternatives analysis apply to replacement bulkheads. Before this bill was passed, those same requirements applied to any landowner, residential or otherwise, who is placing a new bulkhead where there had not been a structure before, or had not been a working structure for a number of years. What this bill did is make it clear that the state should apply those same considerations of preferred alternatives and site assessments, even to replacement bulkheads.
Thank you, Morgan. And we have one more question. If anyone else has any questions, please do provide them in the chat. This question is from Eric, and Eric provides some context and then asks the question. Context: for residential bulkheads we've been supporting over the past year, they've already been subject to the SSB 5273 rules. So our question is, what is different here? Just open it up to any staff member.
Let me take a first crack, and Matt and Teresa can add. So when, and forgive me if this, Eric, let me know if this isn't your question, it might be helpful to others. So when the legislature passes a bill and it works all the way through the process and is adopted, it has an effective date. And so that's essentially the date at which that change to the law becomes effective and becomes governing. And as Matt Curtis said at the beginning, the effective date for this change in law was a little over a year ago. the state has to change rules when a law like that changes, and sometimes that can take some time. And yet what the state generally does, and what WDFW did in this case, was to issue interim guidance to staff, because we have to operate relative to the change in law when the law becomes effective, even though we still have work to do that takes some time to go through the whole process of officially changing the rules themselves to reflect that change. The other important point there, so hopefully, Eric, for you, what that means is adopting these rules, I think for the most part, will institutionalize the practices that WDFW has been implementing over the last year. I think the value and the importance of still going through the rulemaking process, even though it's hopefully not a big change from the last year, is that it makes it really clear and transparent. And to the degree our experiences working with you and others over the last year have helped to clarify what good implementation looks like, now that'll be transparent and available for all applicants to see and rule whether they've had an opportunity to travel that pathway with us over the last year or not. And Matt and Teresa, please, if there's anything I missed.
Yeah, I'll jump in also and say, so yeah, that with the 5273 already being implemented, that it does in some ways feel like this rule proposal doesn't represent a big change, but when you get down into the nitty gritty, it's just the rules have some of the level of detail that the legislature didn't specify. And they usually do that because they want to leave the agency the ability to apply our expertise on handling the details of the matter. And so, some of the elements that didn't come through on the statute are the requirement to use a qualified professional to prepare that site assessment and alternatives analysis report. And then also the specific required elements that we expect to see in that report. And so what putting that, spelling that out in a rule just helps for everyone involved, whether it is an applicant or a contractor or a permitting biologist, to know exactly what the standard is and what everyone is expected to do and see. And then the other big difference, or the newest piece that hasn't been seen before in the rule or in the statute, was also the language clarifying the process for emergency applications and for expedited applications. And again, that just helps clarify for everyone what the expectations are and how the process is going to work.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions, and Eric noted that you did answer his question. Thank you, Eric. And just really appreciate the thoughtful questions that were posed here. Teresa and staff, is there anything else you want to add before we move on to next steps and pull up the table, the comment information table again?
Yeah, I just want to, I think that Tracy had a question that I'm not sure if we fully answered about guidance on the site assessment and alternatives analysis report. And while we have, spelled out the basic elements that we expect for that report, the best place to go for guidance for that is a document or a publication that was produced a few years ago, actually. So it's been around for a little while, and that is the Marine Shoreline Design Guidelines. And that report, or that publication, goes through all the different considerations that should be taken when thinking about how to stabilize the shoreline, or whether or not a shoreline needs to be stabilized. And it walks through a site assessment process, and then also goes through an approach to doing that alternatives analysis. It even has a scoring tool that you can use to score your sites and see where that puts you sort of in that spectrum of alternatives. And so right now that is the primary tool that our permitting biologists use when looking at a project proposal, and it's the preferred alternative, at least to us, it's a preferred alternative for applicants to use when thinking about that report requirements. We did not choose to specifically call that out as the only approach to report preparation in the rule, because there may be other ways. Someone with the correct expertise may be able to take a slightly different approach, or there may be a new publication that comes out that has a different approach, and we want to be open to those other possibilities as long as they at least meet the minimum requirements that are spelled out in the rule.
Thank you, Teresa. And where would people find the guidance document? Is that on the website that you shared, that we are sharing?
Yeah, you can just go to the WDFW homepage and go to the little search box and just plug in Marine Shoreline Design Guidelines.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other comments from staff?
Just, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to everybody. I love to see the number of attendees here, and hopefully more folks will have an opportunity to view this via TVW. And thank you in advance for additional thoughts as those come to you. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Morgan. And thank you, Matt, for adding the guidance document into the chat for people. So with that, Teresa, I was just going to have Annalise pull up how to comment and see if you have anything you'd like to point out or add before we let people go.
I'll just reiterate that that very top address is we have an online portal for submitting comments, and that's probably the easiest approach to take. But again, if you go to the project webpage, which has been posted into the chat at the very beginning of the webinar, and then also is highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the page, that's going to have all the different approaches for submitting comments. So if you prefer to do an email, or you prefer to leave a voice message, or you would like to give oral testimony at the public hearing on the 28th, then information for all of that is on that project website.
Thank you, Teresa. So I will just reiterate, there's a lot of different ways to comment, and just please do key in on that final link. We've added that link into the comment box or the chat box multiple times for you as easy access to access all of these other links here. So with that, unless there's anything else from staff, I'm not seeing any other questions or comments, we can let you go today. Again, really thoughtful comments here. Please do go to this link and provide your comments through this mechanism by October 31st. So with that, I will let everyone go. Thank you so much, and Triangle will stay on in case anyone needs anything. Okay, have a great day.